Hello everyone, this is RedDoot. What's a fun NSFW history fact? Vikings were indeed banging up and down the British coastline like pop culture portrays them, but unlike pop culture imagery of them grabbing women out of their houses and carrying them off. We have writings from the period of British men complaining about Vikings seducing British women, using their unfair advantage of regular bathing and grooming. Canadian soldiers had the highest rates of STDs among Allied troops in both World War I and World War II. Here's a sound archive of JFK having sex because the FBI thought the girl was a German spy and tried recording the conversation. Well, no conversation took place, but a lot of king did. At Andrew Jackson's funeral, his pet parrot was removed because he would not stop cursing. Andrew Jackson won so many duels and had so many lead balls shot into him he was said to make noise like a bag or marbles from them clacking together as he walked around. He also, famously, defied the Supreme Court, specifically Chief Justice John Marshall, ruling about disenfranchisement and removal of Native Americans, specifically the Cherokee Nation in 1831. The state of Georgia wanted their land, and which led to the Indian removals and Trail of Tears to Oklahoma. Most of these duels were fought to defend his wife's honor. She believed that she was divorced from her previous husband when she married Jackson, but that turned out to be false, which led to lots of journalists writing articles smearing her as an unfaithful bigamist whore. This in turn led to Jackson challenging these journalists to duels. Jackson was also infamous for his unorthodox style of dueling. He reasoned that his opponents were liable to rush their shots, thereby missing or scoring bad hits. So Jackson's method of dueling was to just wait until his opponent had fired, then carefully line up a good lethal shot, while the other guy just stood there with an empty pistol. This was considered cruel and ungentlemanly by many at the time. Historians agree that Jackson dueled at least 13 people, but that number is believed to be higher, likely in the hundreds. Andrew Jackson was also the first American president to experience an assassination attempt in 1835. The would-be assassin, a homeless house painter named Richard Lawrence III, drew a pistol on him, which misfired. Jackson was not only 67 at the time, but also unarmed and a fair distance away, but that didn't stop him from charging an armed man and beating the ever-living f*** out of him with his cane during the scuffle. Lawrence then drew another pistol, which also jammed. He was dragged away and Jackson was unharmed, but angry and now paranoid. The funny thing was that the guns were inspected afterwards and were found to be in perfectly working order. One more thing, Jackson was once quoted as saying, "I have only two regrets. I didn't shoot Henry Clay and I didn't hang John C. Calhoun." Basically, Andrew Jackson was a total nutjob and probably needed to be on some sort of medication. Ancient Roman women would use the oil and sweat scraped from gladiators' skin as an aphrodisiac. Well, now we have fanboys buying streamers' bathwater, so time is indeed a flat circle. Soldiers in WW1 would deliberately have sex with STD-ridden prostitute so they could claim medical leave and be discharged to get out of the war. Discharged by discharge, smart move. And then returned home to their unsuspecting wives and sweethearts with a gift that kept on giving. That must have prompted some interesting conversations and emotional dissonance. Much conspiracy has been made about J.P. Morgan choosing not to sail on Titanic at the last minute. But the reality was it was his birthday week and he was having way too much fun with his French mistress. He skipped Titanic because the sex was too good and he wanted to stay. The quick extra fun fact. Although Morgan died in 1913, the financial fallout from the Titanic disaster hit him so badly it was a massive factor in contributing to them seeking bankruptcy protection in 1915. This was astounding, coming from the company that had bailed out the entire US government in 1907. So, Morgan skipping Titanic got him screwed in more ways than one. The last mainline descendant of the Medici family, John Gaston de Medici, spent most of the last years of his reign laying in bed being entertained by a group of handsome young men rounded up from the streets of Florence who performed various sexual acts in his bedroom for his entertainment. He spent so much time in his gay harem that people rumored he had died, since he never appeared in public. Eventually he did show up in public to dismiss rumors of his death. He showed up so drunk he could barely speak, threw up twice, and then had to be physically carried back to his bedchamber. Apparently, the butt plug was originally invented as a rectal dilator, marketed as a cure for insanity and constipation. What are you doing, step doctor? King Philip V of Spain, 1683 to 1746, and his court liked to play a game called El Improviso, the imperturbable. Basically, a bunch of men bottom naked were sitting around a table, which was covered by a cloth. A lady was under the table and sucked one of the men's cock. The rest of the players should guess who was being sucked. If their guess was correct, the other player had to leave the game. If it was wrong, he would leave. The game was won by the player who would cum in the lady's mouth without the rest of the players noticing. Apparently the game was very popular among the French nobility in 18th century. KGB once planned to blackmail the first Indonesian president, Sukarno, by sending him Russian women disguised as flight attendant Sukarno, infamous for his womanizer behavior, then had sex with them, while KGB secretly recorded the affairs. KGB later showed him the sex tapes, and to their surprise, Sukarno was instead thrilled and even asked for more copies to show to his people back in the country. The plan ultimately failed. He even thanked the KGB for sending the women. Ancient Egyptians believed that the god of creation birthed the world by masturbating and viewed it as a magical act. Didn't need an Egyptian god of creation for me to realize it's magical. Air wizard Harry, air jizzer Harry. Not only that, but I vaguely recall reading that the pharaohs would masturbate into the Nile. Egyptians believed pharaohs were gods themselves, so they assumed that the pharaoh's secret sauce would lead to a better crop. Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, frequently had sex in a graveyard next to her own mother's grave. He lost her virginity having sex on her mother's grave. Also, the Frankenstein story was allegedly written after a drug-fueled orgy. Mary Shelley, her fiancé, and her stepsister were visiting the famous poet Lord Byron in 1816, the year without a summer because it was cold outside and there wasn't much else to do back then. The four end up having an orgy while Lord Byron's personal physician watched. Afterwards, they're all doing a bunch of opium, and Percy Shelley has a hallucination of a demon. This prompts Lord Byron to suggest they start telling scary stories. Lord Byron tells a story of a vampire, Percy Shelley does some story based on his childhood. Mary Shelley, an aspiring author about to tell a story to one of the most famous authors of her time, asks for some extra time to think about it. She comes back with Frankenstein. My favorite part of that is Mary's work is the most important one to our culture now. Lord Byron and Percy are massive in the literary canon, but the average person can't name a single poem by either, nor recite any, but most people can at least give you the broad strokes of Frankenstein. Mary was the GOAT, inventing science fiction and boning dudes and smoking opium in the Victorian era, hell yeah. Julius Caesar had sex with many women, including the mothers, sisters, and wives of anyone who insulted him. And while he was on trial for his involvement in the Catalan conspiracy, he got a letter. Cato saw this and wanted to know what it was, but Caesar refused. Cato insisted, and so Caesar read. It was a letter from Cato's sister about all the things she wanted him to do to her. Chevalier d'Eon was a French diplomat and spy in England and Russia. Once he retired, he revealed to the public that he had been a woman the entire time. She was henceforth made to wear gender-appropriate clothing for the rest of her life. She went on to write some books and support the American Revolution, but here's the kicker: when she died they found out she was actually a man the whole time. He was double cross-dressing. John Hanning Spoke was a British explorer in the 1800s who was known for one of the first Westerners visiting Mecca and then exploring some of Africa's largest lakes while trying to find the source of the Nile. He had syphilis for a large part of his life. While in Africa he contracted a high fever. The fever was so high that it essentially burned the syphilis bacteria and cured him. Supposedly Cleopatra used semen as a facial moisturizer. In the 1800s the middle finger was a sign of threatening someone with sex. Fuck you suddenly make so much sense. Thanks for watching, this was RedDoot. If you enjoyed the content, make sure to check out my other content.